Good evening, Jolanta. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another session of Bright Hearts Q&A, Facebook Live Q&A. Tonight, we are very honored to have Jolanta Lasota as our guest. Jolanta is the Chief Executive Officer of Ambitious About Autism, which is a charity that provides support for children and young adults who have ASC or autism. Good evening, Jolanta, and welcome.
Good evening, John. Delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real honor.
Thank you for being here. Jolanta, I'd like you to begin by telling us a little bit about your charity, about Ambitious About Autism. What is it you do? What kind of support do you have? I understand that you're running some schools also. Please tell us all about it. I'd love to hear about it. Thank you.
Yes, well, Ambitious About Autism is the national charity for children and young people with autism. And our mission is to make the ordinary possible for children and young people with autism. And by that, we mean enabling young people to access education, enable them to be part of their communities, to enjoy good health and well-being, to have prospects of work. So all the things that all children and young people should expect of life. And we do that by running direct schools and colleges for young people on the autism spectrum. We also provide information and raise awareness and understanding of autism. And we campaign for change in policy and practice nationally. Our schools and colleges are based in London and the Southeast, and they're all special schools and specialist colleges, and they serve a range of young people from 4 to all the way up to 25 across the whole autism spectrum.
Thank you, Jolanta. Thanks for giving us an introduction. I have read about you with great interest, and we believe that the support that you're providing is crucial for many parents out there who wouldn't know what to do otherwise. Now that we're talking about individuals with ASC, one of the things I would like to address tonight is the fact that there are so many myths and misconceptions surrounding ASC. And I believe that many of them have caused a stigma to children, to young adults, to adults with autism. I would like to say that those of us who have worked with children with autism, for example, young adults with autism, know that despite some of these misconceptions, you realize that like any other group of human beings, people with autism have incredible differences. And I'd like you to tell us about some of these erroneous ideas, some of these myths, some of these misconceptions, to dispel them. And instead tell us a little bit about your experience with different people who have autism and how they can be so different one from another and what they can offer. I've met some incredible individuals who have incredible skills that I would love to have myself. Go ahead.
So, I mean, I suppose the first thing to start with is that people's awareness and understanding of autism is increasing, and how people define autism is changing. But, broadly speaking, autism affects people in the way that they communicate and interact with the world. And that's a very broad description, but it needs to be broad because people on the autism spectrum are very different. That when you've met one person with autism, you have met one person with autism. So autistic people often also have additional conditions such as learning disability or epilepsy, or dyslexia or dyspraxia, and sometimes that becomes confused with autism. So when people meet an autistic person, they confuse maybe some of those things with autism. So there are lots of myths about autism, and the number one myth is, of course, Rain Man, because most people associate autism still with Rain Man, and so they assume that autistic people are all savants or have special interests, and that will be true of some autistic people, but many autistic people, just are just ordinary like everybody else and don't have these sort of incredible special interests. So that's the number one myth that we often hear. Another myth is that autistic children don't have empathy, don't have feelings. People have some sort of very strange ideas about this. And the truth is that autistic young people feel like everybody else. But what they will struggle sometimes with is social understanding and communication, and find it sometimes difficult to express these feelings. And so people get confused by that. And that includes professionals, not just parents. Um, Another myth is that autism just affects boys, it's a boy thing. And of course, more boys are diagnosed with autism than girls, but we're starting to understand a lot more about how autism presents in girls, and more girls are being diagnosed. And what we think is that girls are just more able to mask some of those differences better, and so don't get spotted until later in life. So they're often diagnosed with other conditions like anxiety or eating disorders before they're diagnosed with autism. And I guess the final one, which I'd really love to explode this myth, is that autistic children have challenging behaviour. And I always say to people, no one is born with challenging behaviour. Autistic young people start to show signs of distress when the environment isn't right for them, and when their needs are not well understood and met. And I always say to people that behaviour is just a form of communication, and that we need to listen to that behaviour and change how we support young people. And then we will see some of these behaviours disappear. But I think those are some of the really main myths I hear about. And they deeply impact on children and young people with autism, because people who support them often approach them with some of these myths and some of these attitudes. And so it's really essential that we get training and information out there to anyone supporting an autistic child or young person.
Thank you so much. That was very reassuring. I can certainly vouch for every one of those words from my own experience, and having spoken to many parents and individuals with autism directly, they can certainly say the same thing. You have mentioned diagnosis, and one of the things that many parents are uncertain about is exactly that. How do you get a diagnosis in the first place? I would say that many parents, in fact, are very uncertain about what to do in general, about what kind of support they can get. How can they get a diagnosis? How can they get an EHCP? What kind of other support can they get later on? Would you mind telling us a little bit about it so that we can reach out to all those parents who really need this right now? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, apart from anything, I'm a parent of an autistic child myself. So I really feel for and understand what it's like to go through that process. And I can understand that when parents start having concerns about their child, it can be very distressing and very confusing. So the first thing I would say to parents is that, there is time, and there is no need to panic, because your child just has a difference, and we need to discover more about that difference and how we can support them. It is a long journey because the system is very strapped for cash, and so it can take a long time to get a diagnosis and then support. But again, as long as you really are persistent, you can get there. So my first advice to parents is always to read around the subject, read about autism, read about diagnosis and how to get support, and go to reputable places to read about that. So there are nice guidelines on diagnosis which say what the process should be in the timeline. So read those and make sure you understand that. Go to Ambitious About Autism's website, or there's National Autistic Society, lots of reputable websites. but I'd really recommend staying away from some of the rogues. There are lots of rogues on the internet selling quick cures, quick fixes for autism, and none of those are suitable. So, as tempting as it is to sometimes read these things, they're not very helpful. The second thing I would say is it's important to know what you want from the process so that you can explain that to people. So think about what are the barriers your child faces and what support do you think they need. And sometimes it helps to keep a diary because you can then start to think clearly about what is it that's particularly worrying you, what support do you think your child needs. And the third thing I would say is it's a long journey. So find your allies, go and speak to your GP, show them the diary, explain to them what your concerns are, go and speak to your school Senko. If you don't find these people helpful, ask around family and friends whether they know anybody who's involved in this sort of thing that can talk to you, because it can be a very lonely journey without somebody holding your hand a bit. And Ambitious About Autism, we have a Talk About Autism forum where parents talk to each other, and there are other forums like that. So it's a journey that you take step by step. And find allies and find support and inform yourself. But as I said before, there's lots of quacks and cures out there. Autism is a lifelong condition. There is no cure, and neither should be their cure. Your child is a wonderful child who just has some differences and needs some support.
It's certainly a very long journey, and it can be a very lonely journey. But you are absolutely right. We have seen it ourselves many, many times, how this support can go such a long way, and it can contribute to make that journey so much easier for all parties involved, especially for the person, of course, who has ASC.
Mm.
And one of the things that we have noticed, and we have talked about in other Facebook Live sessions, as a matter of fact, is the fact that lockdown has had such a deep impact on children, especially. In general, the general student population has suffered terribly as a result of it. There have been many cases of anxiety. We have talked about this in the past, also during one of our sessions. And I'm sure you have been able to witness plenty of experiences of children with ASC who have, in one way or another, suffered as a result of it. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that, about the impact of lockdown on children in terms of their mental health, their well-being, what academic impact it may have had?
Mm. So absolutely, and the world's been turned upside down for everybody. Everybody has had change, but for autistic children, that has been particularly challenging because of many autistic children like routine, like predictability, and that's been taken away. So during lockdown, the experience of young people was very variable in terms of accessing education. Some were in school full time and some were at home full time. But for all of those children, their daily routine was disrupted, and many young people found that really, really hard to handle. We also found that many young people's mental health really suffered from that change of routine, but also because they were overhearing things about the pandemic and really worried about it. And I experienced lots and lots of things with this young people at school and college, but also nationally. I mean, I can give an example where one young man in one of our schools became so worried about the economic circumstances that he was worried that the school wouldn't reopen. And he was writing all the time on emails, worried that the school wouldn't reopen. So we actually showed him our report and accounts and our bank statements to show him how much money was in the bank, just to reassure him that we did have money and the school would be there for him. And those are the sorts of things that young people really worried about, and perhaps not some of the things that adults thought they would be worried about. We know also that many young people had real trouble accessing technology to enable this sort of learning. I'm ambitious about autism. We provided laptops to all of our children and young people who could use them automatically. We didn't wait for government funding. We used our charitable funds to do that. But we know nationally many young people just didn't have the technology. You know, parents may just have a phone, and all the kids would be sharing that phone to do some learning. Also, many young people missed out on things like the therapies that they would normally have, whether it would be support from, speech therapy or OT, and that really impacted on them too. There were some positives though, and we need to learn from those positives. Some young people really benefited from virtual learning. They benefited from the lack of distraction, from the one-to-one support, from being in their own environment, and many parents report their young people learnt really well in this environment. We also know for some young people that being at home was more comfortable because the environment at school is busy. Sometimes children experience bullying. Sometimes they're asked to leave in the middle of the day, which is very upsetting and disruptive. So being at home was more comfortable, although that presents its own challenges because then you have to leave home at some point, and then you have an addition transition from home back into school. So there are some positives, and people ought to learn from those positives. So increasingly, people really need to think about how this sort of access to online learning is beneficial for young people, and how the environment can be adjusted even further for them to make school comfortable. The return to school has been challenging because some young people found that disruption enormous, and some of them, even the ones who were in school throughout lockdown, found it hard because suddenly their school became very busy, and so they found that really disruptive. And we can't forget that some young people still have not returned to school for various reasons. Either a school place hasn't been made available for them, or they've been shielding with their parents, so their parents haven't wanted them to return to school, or their school hasn't been ready for them. And many of those young people have not yet returned to school. So we need to be thinking about those young people too. And going forwards, we can see the news is changing daily, and predictability is going to be something that really impacts on young people. So we need to think about how we provide them with continuity. So ensuring that if there is any closing of a school bubble or a lockdown, that we're able to switch straight away into online learning and keep in touch straight away and move them smoothly into a new routine, that we provide timetables and support for them, that we make sure that the most vulnerable pupils are always in school, and that's really important, that we don't lose young people along the way. I know from lots of schools, there's lots of young people that have been lost in the system, and that's tragic. It should never happen, and we need to make sure if we do have to take further measures, that we're really staying in very close contact with families and making sure that we put our arms of support around them, provide them whatever practical support we can to make sure that young people are safe and well looked after and still learning.
Yes, despite the fact that many of that the children, vulnerable children, were meant to go to school during lockdown, we know for a fact, because figures are overwhelmingly they're very, very, very clear in this regard. We know for a fact that they did not. The parents and carers did not feel that the conditions were there for them to go back to school. So there has been a great degree of exclusion. There are, of course, as you mentioned, some very positive stories behind this. We have seen, in a bit of an unorthodox manner, but we have seen the incredible potential of online learning. It can be really fruitful, provided you get the right support, of course. Not all children have it, unfortunately, but provided you do, it can be extremely fruitful. We have seen the same thing for the population in general, but of course we know how much harder it can be for individuals with ASC who may not be able to communicate what they're feeling as easily as maybe neurotypical children.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a sector that has been often forgotten, children have been, the issue with children has been addressed but I think that the sector has been forgotten is post-16 children or young adults who are seeking employment. And we were wondering how Ambitious About Autism has been able to help these post-16 children and young adults seeking employment.
Yes, I mean, for me, that's an area very close to my heart because we know that the figures around employment for autistic adults are shocking. Only 16% of autistic adults are in full-time paid employment. So we know that that journey is very difficult from childhood up to adulthood. And during lockdown, a lot of the things that should have happened, transition reviews, admission meetings into new settings just didn't happen. So we know that has been a really difficult transition for young people. And again, we need to be really, really careful that we fought for years for young people to transition from education into training and employment, and we mustn't lose those gains over this pandemic. Those were hard fought for gains, and we mustn't lose them. So we know that the first biggest priority is to keep those young people in education, because many of them will have lost many months of learning. And so making sure they're in education and catching up and gaining that learning again is really, really important. We also need to make sure that we're doing transition planning with them so that all of the agencies involved are actually planning for what happens post 16, whether they're going to continue in sixth form or whether they're going to go to college or whether they're going to get a placement perhaps in an internship or apprenticeship. We've got to make sure that planning is taking place. The key thing for autistic young people is adapted careers advice, and we know of only a very small percentage of young people get that, and that is critical because helping young people to imagine their future and think about what's going to happen is really critical, and also helping their parents to see all of the options. Often parents of autistic children are exhausted by the time their child's 16, and so it's hard sometimes to see all those options, but actually opening up those options is really, really important, and getting some form of work experience. So at Ambitious About Autism, we run a big program called Employ Autism, where we support young people to access careers advice. We're training careers advisors in autism so they can better advise young people, and we're training employers and setting up work experience programs for young people. And the great thing this year is many employers, rather than cancel those work experience programs, have done them virtually with young people. And it's amazing how great that experience was for young people. So for young people actually doing work from home for an employer and joining in team meetings and doing all of those things and getting that basic experience. For many autistic young people, the challenge of going into employment isn't necessarily the academic side or the side around the content of the job. It's the social side. It's understanding how to cope with meetings, how to cope with being at your desk, what adjustments you're going to need at work. So it's really important that young people get those tasters, and we're expanding that scheme with even more employers, and working even on things like volunteering. So if there isn't an employment opportunity locally, just getting that experience of going somewhere different, learning work skills, having structure, they're all really important things for all of our lives. We all get structure from work, and that's no different for autistic people. They need that structure to actually connect with the world and build a social circle, and of course be economically active. So my advice to parents and professionals is, planning's really critical, and looking at whatever opportunity, even if it's not the opportunity you really desired for your child, whatever opportunity to keep moving them forward and keep that structure going whilst things get back to whatever we will call the new normal is really important.
It is extremely important that you're there throughout the process, not just at the very beginning, not just for young children with ASC, but throughout, even when they're seeking employment, support within their workplace. It's definitely crucial to their development.
Yeah, and one thing I just wanted to add is I think it's also important. Many young people learn later in life. They have difficult times at school, and sometimes school is is just a very challenging place for them. So often parents will see their child come to life, come to fruition when they're actually having these experiences of work, and finding that one thing that really interests them, that motivates them, is really critical. So, some parents will say to me, "Work's been school's been a terrible thing for them," and sometimes it really can be, but sometimes training programs, internships, apprenticeships, all of those things can really bring a young person to life, and they can really flourish in those arenas.
It certainly can. We have seen it ourselves, definitely. And I'm glad that you're doing such a wonderful job in that regard. If we broaden the spectrum a little bit, I'd like you to tell me a little bit what you think that parents, schools, or even the local authority can do to provide support for children and young adults with autism.
I mean, my first thing is always to listen to them. I think that young people have got their own views, have got their own. They've heard different things than we have. So listening to them and listening to the things that they're positive about, like perhaps they might tell you they've really enjoyed online learning, or they may tell you they've hated it, and listening to them about the worries they've got, because young people are hearing adults talking about the pandemic, and they're hearing the news, and they often get very concerned about some of that. So listening to them and finding out what are the things that are working, what are the things that are really worrying you, is I would say the most fundamental thing, because we'll uncover things that perhaps we don't expect. The second thing is planning any of these transitions. So whether it's transition back to home because a bubble's closed, or back into school, really, really important that parents and schools work together to plan those transitions. And really important that schools listen to parents to know what it's been like for young people at home, what's their experience been like, and what are the things that they may need going back to school. And taking that time will make those transitions successful. I think actually plugging them back into all of the old things, even if they're done differently. So if they were receiving therapeutic support, even if it has to be done online, it's really important to get them plugged into that. And it's good news that the government confirmed, I think it was about a week ago, that children's services should not be disrupted in any further lockdown, that those professionals should remain in their jobs to provide support to those young people. And so we shouldn't see the same disruption we saw before. But plugging young people back into some of those routines is really important. So if they're part of some sort of group, that group might not be able to meet face to face, but if they can do something online, that is really important, because young people will be connecting with each other again. I think the other thing is young people have, whilst being at home, found new interests. So allowing them to explore and develop those new interests is really important, because that is a way of coping with things emotionally, is to fill your life with positive new things. So it might be that some young people might have adopted bird watching or walking, and that's as important in terms of learning as any other formal learning. So allowing them to find those new interests in this new environment is really important.
Jolanta, I could listen for hours. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. So I would just like to ask you if you would be happy to share some final words with our viewers. Tell us a little bit about how anyone can reach out to Ambitious About Autism if they're in need of any support.
Yeah, so if you need support, just come to our website, ambitiousabouautism.org.uk, and you can find lots of information. There's a whole coronavirus hub there, so you can find lots of information about education, health, social care, all of those things on that hub, about education, about diagnosis. That's a good first point of call. We also have Talk About Autism, where parents can talk to each other. Um, and of course, if you're looking for a school or college place, then on there you'll find details of our admissions team. And quite often they will also talk to you about other provisions if they would be more suitable. So do get in touch. We're here to support. And also it's important that parents are able to support each other. So, do get in touch with each other too. There are also other great websites, National Autistic Society, IPSIA, a whole load of other organisations that are here to support young people and parents and carers. So do go and find that information and support it. It's there for you. And many organisations are here to support children, young people and parents at this difficult time.
It has been a real pleasure, Jolanta. I have gained plenty of insight out of this conversation, as usual, like every time I talk to you. And I'm sure that our viewers agree that it has been extremely insightful. I'm very thankful to you for joining us tonight and for sharing all these wonderful experiences and anecdotes with us. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for watching. We hope you can join us soon for another Q&A Facebook Live session. Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.